Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad it's warming up. I was thinking of T.S. Eliot last week. April is the cruelest month, so yeah, feels like another world already. What do I want to do? Oh man, first quick comment. The line that we've been repeating at the end of at least my contributions to this question of what is the good life, what we've left each other with is Socrates each week, which we'll do it again today. And his, very simply, which has already been mentioned, the unexamined life is not worth living. In some sense, that's the answer to the question that we've been hovering around. What is the good life? To live an examined life. That's sort of what Socrates is offering. What do we mean by that? We mean it in every respect we can think of. Values, ethics, virtue, those were good Greek words. Social justice, humor. Thank you, David, for your reflection, meditation. Humor, what else? Examining our beliefs and what we find beautiful, the good, the beautiful, and the true. Meaning, love, death, all the good stuff. That's the examined life. Turning toward these things. A life not worth living is not examining. Living in denial, repression, blindness. And I guess as a community, in some sense, even doing 2 months on what is the good life is in our own way trying to turn toward it. Trying to turn toward some self-examination and, of course, examination of culture and the world that we live in and the world that we inhabit and the wild world that we're all a part of, which Earth Day sort of comes in as a beacon reminding us that of our smallness as creatures on this planet, that even as a species we haven't been inhabiting all that long, although we march around as if we own the place. So if I had to guess, Earth Day seems to symbolize the most important sort of, I might call it spiritual, but you might not, holiday for the 21st century, and if there's going to be a 22nd century. Just because of all the reasons we already know. So anyway, that's not what I'm here necessarily to talk about. I want to begin with Rilke's poem here. I live my life in widening circles. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one. You won't. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I live my life in widening circles. I circle around God, the primordial tower. I've been circling for 1,000 years. And I still don't know, am I a falcon? A storm? Or a great song? I live my life in widening circles. Part of what I want to suggest this morning, a couple things, I got a couple themes going on, is that part of the good life, in my mind, is this spiral outwards. This expansion. A widening circle. What would be the opposite of this image? Circling the drain, I suppose. Into more and more narrow realities until you get sucked down. But here Rilke says, I live my life in widening circles. So there's something about expansion and growth and inclusion and width. I live my life in widening circles. And that's part of the examined life. Politics, art, religion, science, morality, ethics, virtue, social justice. Yes, to all of them. I live my life in widening circles. And I think part of what I want to say just from the beginning, it has to do with vision. What do we envision life to be like? And what do we envision life to be like for young people right now? Is it a life of widening circles? Is that the vision we have for our own lives and for our kids and their kids? Or live your life in kind of pretty narrow confines, just kind of tightening the circles and circling the wagons and self-protection and fear and isolation until you're alone. And I'm putting these two extremes out there, but they work on the very subtle level. No one would want the life of circling the drain, except subtly, that's what we end up communicating and sometimes envisioning. That's why a thing like Earth Day is kind of shocking in the sense of, wait, I'm supposed to have a conscious awareness of the earth? We haven't even explored the seas. The oceans. We know very little about what's in the ocean. All right. So that's part of what I want to say today. I live my life in widening circles, and I want us to be thinking about what kind of life we are envisioning. One time when I was in college, I went to class, and in college, that's actually the surprising part, that I went to class. And I hadn't been to my world literature class since it started, okay? Or something like that, or barely been. And I actually liked literature, and in fact, something I found a teacher in high school to be kind of inspiring, and she sort of pointed me in the direction of a recognition that I liked images and stories and metaphors and things like that. So it wasn't like a subject that I hated, but I didn't go to class. And so one day I went and I'm sitting there, and the teacher's up front, Mrs. Chamberlain and Dr. Chamberlain, and she's passing something out, and I lean over to, I believe maybe my girlfriend, who would one day become my wife. I said, what's she passing out? And she's like, the test? So, yeah, off to a good start. And so, yeah, it comes, and I look at the test, and I realize it's on Greek mythology. Now, there's a problem in that when I was real little, I went to a Christian school, and Greek mythology was not a part of the curriculum, believe it or not, because those were pagan gods. And I had never come across any Greek stories, really. I just looked at it, I was like, I don't know any of this. But, being overly confident, it's like, I'll be fine, and just filling out all these things. And by the way, if I was going to say if you're like me, you're probably not. But in situations like this where you get nervous, I just tried to fill out the test as fast as possible so I could just appear to be confident and slap it down in the front. And I got it back the next class period that I went to, and I got a 3%. Yeah, this is in college. Yeah, you pay for classes in college, by the way. 3%, and that's how little I knew of Greek mythology. That was an accurate grade. And shortly thereafter, it gets worse. The story. I decided to change my major to English, but my world literature grade, I never climbed out of the D's because I couldn't recover from 3%. I tried, but I couldn't. So I had to take the class again. And the professor, Dr. Chamberlain, said, all right, let's do it as an independent study. And all you're going to do is come to my class, and for an entire semester, you're going to read the Odyssey. That's it. It's your only assignment. And it had a surprising effect on me. Even though I don't even remember anything that we talked about in her office, it's like I got sucked into this world that I didn't know existed. This strange story of the Odyssey. And probably, as I'm saying it now, as I'm just thinking, it probably had a bigger effect on my life than I've realized up until saying it right now. Maybe it set a kind of course. Maybe, in a sense, it set a kind of course for a widening circle. After all, raised in Christian fundamentalism, I thought only the Bible really mattered anyway, like all the rest of the stories were just like fluff. Then the real thing was the Bible, was the sort of the world I grew up in. That wasn't my experience reading this like provocative and weird story, the Odyssey. So I decided to pick it up again recently. So a couple months ago, I got out my copy of the Odyssey and I started reading, and I got kind of bored, to tell you the truth, because I didn't realize the first 4 chapters essentially are about Telemachus. This is Odysseus' son. And I don't know, I kind of was dragging my feet a bit, and a couple weeks ago I heard a podcast by a guy named Michael Meade, who's like a mythologist storyteller that I follow and like a lot. And he said, let's talk about the Odyssey, but let's talk about Telemachus. I said, that's interesting. So these like weird sort of things were aligning for me. I was like, what? And I started thinking about Telemachus, because what an interesting way to open up the story of the Odyssey, not with Odysseus, right? Why start with the next generation? Here's a kid, anywhere between 15 and 20 years old, at home, living in a house in a kingdom that is essentially falling apart. And all of the values, the good Greek values, like what is a good life, a life of virtue, nobility, and kingship, are all being squandered by the suitors. And they're literally eating up the kingdom. They're eating Odysseus's storehouses and, grain fields and sheep and goats or whatever they're eating back then. They're consuming it, and they're consumed by greed. That's how the story opens. Now imagine if there was an empire that was living off the backs of someone else, greedily consuming. Yeah. It's hard to imagine. So, what better place than to start, not with Odysseus, the so-called hero, but his son? Because the real question is, what is Telemachus going to do? Not is Odysseus going to get home. When he gets home, he's an old man, and only his dog recognizes him. Really, the question Homer is putting is, what about the next generation? What kind of vision do they have for the world? Will Telemachus live his life in widening circles or not? Or will he live his life in this kind of downward small spiral? And the story opens with suffering, which is my other theme this morning. What does the good life have to do with suffering? Really, the two greatest stories that are deep inside really Western consciousness are stories from the Bible and the Odyssey. The other major story from the Bible is about Moses. It's the grand narrative of at least the Torah. How does the story open with Moses? Anybody know? With suffering. They find themselves slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then you have this kid, Moses, being raised in a house of opulence, but something's off about it. He has inherited a way of life that's relative, a life of education and leisure, but something's amiss. It's as if the empire is built on the backs of someone else, which it is. And it's not until he bumps into suffering that the story begins. And he murders an Egyptian and has to run to the desert. And Telemachus wakes up one day and can't handle it anymore. He cannot handle the suitors consuming his father's kingdom, and he goes walking on the beach, and Mentor greets him, and Athena shows up, and they basically say, leave. Go on the big journey, and go find out what you're made of. It's search for your father, but that's not really what he's searching for. He's searching for the kind of inner father, the inner king, so that he can live the full life, the good life, as the Greeks would define it. In other words, come home and kick ass, with the suitors and clean up and live a life of, I don't think it says kick ass in Homer, in the Odyssey, but small life. And so, and part of what I'm posing this morning is that there's something about suffering hardship, heartache, heartbreak, suffering, social injustice, personal existential suffering, where something like a fork appears in the road. And either suffering is going to be a story that makes you small or a story that helps you expand. And sometimes it's not always an either or. Sometimes it makes you small too, but it also poses a sort of question on your life. And we live in a world where there's a lot of suffering. And will that suffering widen your circle or make it smaller into the realm of self-protection, narcissism, personal gain, entitlement, and at least I'll be safe in my bunker in the basement with bottled water? It's a kind of extreme. Am I making sense? So these are things I think, that I'm trying to just hover a bit around, which is why I put this pretty famous opening line of M. Scott Peck's book, Life is Difficult. Life is difficult. I could have just put that, but then it wouldn't really count for much of a reading. Life is difficult. Yeah, because it is. It is difficult. And it's also the first premise in Buddhism, right? Life is suffering. And of course, now Buddhism is a religion that acknowledges very directly, or if it's even a religion, some people might argue about that, but Buddhism is a way that says most of suffering comes from attachments and our attachment to attachments. Now, that might not be true of all kinds of suffering, but we can leave that to the philosophers. But there's certainly something true to that. The moment somebody dangles something in front of you that you can't have, and your attachments wake up, you suffer because you don't have it. And so Buddhism is, of course, about releasing attachments. And that's, by the way, what I think M. Scott Peck is getting at here about acceptance and its grip that it has on you. You can read the quote and ponder it maybe later today. So life is difficult. So one of the things that I think is a kind of popular legacy from Christianity, which in my view comes from a misreading of the Torah, a misreading of Genesis, and that is, because it doesn't actually say this in Genesis, that Adam and Eve experienced the fall. Correct? They fell. From what? Well, they fell from paradise and the way everything was great, and I remember as a little kid even thinking, like, what idiots, like you had everything, not realizing, of course, like. Of course, that's what they're going to do. That's the way myths work. As soon as someone in the myth says you can't do that, right away that's what they're going to do. So, but the popular legacy, is that life shouldn't be difficult. It's kind of somewhere hovering around in the back of our Western consciousness. It shouldn't be this way. And on the one hand, I want to acknowledge there's some truth to that. When you see real suffering in the world, especially injustice, you think it shouldn't be this way. On the other hand, we have to also acknowledge it is this way. It is difficult. That's the way life is. In fact, I would say you don't even have a story of humanity until Adam and Eve know death, are aware of their own mortality and the terror of being a free moral agent, as the philosophers would say. In other words, the ability to choose. Now you know what it's like to be a human being. So part of the legacy is that it shouldn't be this way. And of course, in Christian illusion, it's really bad. It's really bad now. It shouldn't be this way. And then certainly in the near future, it's all going to be fixed. So might as well just, buy a boat and, just chill. The other probably modern thread is that technology will save us. That's the product of the industrial growth model, really, that eventually, and is there some truth to that? Well, it will save us from some things. We can eradicate some diseases. We've created antibiotics that have helped many, many thousands of people. And now, of course, there are such things as superbugs, which is kind of a metaphor to me, in the sense of path of increased technology has its own shadow side. So I'm just bringing these up as sort of like themes that put us in a state where we want to say it shouldn't be this way. We don't want to come to a place, what M. Scott Peck is suggesting, of acceptance. Life is suffering. Like Buddhism 101, life is suffering. What I want to suggest, which sounds so ironic if I just put it out there, that part of living the good life is turning towards suffering. See, when I put it that way, isn't there something in you, or even if you imagine popular culture, that says that doesn't make any sense? Part of the good life is turning towards suffering. Part of the good life is acknowledging suffering. Part of the good life is accepting some measure of suffering. That's how the Odyssey starts. I present to you a world of enormous suffering where the suitors are squandering all of the resources, filled with greed and lust, and you're just a kid. Think about those kids from Parkland. That's the opening scene of the Odyssey. That is Emma with her shaved head. And you better believe, just as Telemachus goes down on the beach and is filled with the power of Athena, he comes back to the suitors and tells them how it is. And then he says, and I'm going to go away and find out if my father is really alive or not. And when I come back, we're going to fix this. And they're kind of like in awe that Telemachus has woken up from his slumber of childhood. But then they ignore him in the Odyssey. Just like, for some reason, now I'm on this image of Emma standing there in silence. Did you watch that? And some in our culture, some suitors, were saying things like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just a kid. You know, you have some kind of agenda. You know, you can't say shut your mouth because she stood there in silence. Yeah, so, all right. What am I saying? I'm saying that part of the good life is acknowledging that this tension exists, that life is going to break your heart. Like David White says, did you think you were going to get out of this without a broken heart? And so Athena greets Telemachus on the beach and says to him, you should not go on clinging to your childhood. You should not go on to clinging to ideas like, oh, it shouldn't be this way, and the good life should involve zero suffering. That's an infantilizing notion. Athena says, sorry, you should not go on clinging to your childhood. You are no longer of an age to do that. You're no longer of an age to do that. So life is imperfect, and that is the invitation. And something was coming up in our sort of spiritual inquiry, which is the group that meets before this, and we're hovering around. Leslie was bringing up, which I think is such a lovely word, of risk. That to live full on in the world, in widening circles, involves a tremendous amount of risk. You're going to have your heart broken. You know, go back to your, high school days when you were with someone that you thought at the time you were falling in love with, whatever you thought that was in high school or when you were a young person, and your heart is beating, and to open yourself up and say, do you want to go out? Or whatever you said. I don't know what people do today, but do you want to Snapchat? Or I'm not sure. That's risk. And back to my image. Do you want to live in a small, safe world of smaller circles or widening circles? What kind of vision? What do we imagine life to be? But to live your life in widening circles is to take some serious risks. And that means you're going to have your heart broken. Um, so I keep thinking about this, like both with Telemachus and Moses. Moses has to flee, and by the way, there's now that I'm thinking of it, he has to have a kind of a divine encounter too, where Athena and Mentor meet Telemachus on the beach. Moses has to meet the divine in the burning bush, but also on the earth itself. He has this experience because the voice says, "The place you are standing is holy ground." The earth itself is sacred, and he takes off his shoes. He has this moment of divine encounter, which sets the course or the question for the biggest story he can live. Will Moses take his place as a kind of redemptive figure or not? Do you know he could just stay in the desert? Be like, thanks, but I'm going to go back to shepherding because it's relatively safe. And he's married and he's got a family already. Why not just chill, take it easy? Desert air's nice. I'm getting old. Might as well go south or whatever. I didn't mean that in any kind of just thinking desert, south, whatever. You're going to drive me out with pitchforks. But I mean it in the biggest possible sense, taking your place, the largest story you can live, or finding your voice, offering your gift, or like in Buddhism, causing the least suffering you can in the world. Living for something larger. This is what I think is going on with this story, this sort of question that's posed to Moses and Telemachus. And imagine it in a psycho-spiritual sense. Imagine that this too is happening in you, that you're walking along the beach and Mentor shows up and Athena shows up, or you're Moses out there in the wild world in the desert, and something is posing this larger question on your life. Some great mystery is involved. Whispering, do you want to live your life in widening circles? If you do, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. But also it's going to be good. It's going to hurt. It's going to be good at the same time. It's going to be good enough. And I was thinking about this role of mentor, because I've actually said this before in previous talks, and I think you would agree. I think we're missing the elders in our community. We're missing the voice of the elders. Especially we live in a culture that really worships the voice of youth. Wouldn't you agree? Whoever is the hottest and the newest and the youngest, and that's where the needle is pointing in our compass, and so we're missing the voice of the elders. We're missing Mentor. Mentor is an interesting figure now that I think of it in the Odyssey, because he didn't go off to war with Odysseus. He was already too old to go to war. I think, if I remember the story correctly. But he stays at home. So he has this body of wisdom grown from life itself, from just living longer, from experiencing a few of the risks and heartaches that I'm talking about. And also, the question on Mentor is, what are you going to do with this body of wisdom? And he chooses, inspired by Athena. Athena also enters him, and he gives like this awesome speech to Telemachus. But in a sense, he meets Telemachus on the beach and shares, like a guide would, what a big vision of life looks like. What's a big vision? In other words, what should our elders be doing in the world? If you think about these young people, if you think about Emma, what should they be doing? They should be joining them on the beach, so to speak. Joining them on the beach. What is it like to be you? And I'll share what it's like to be me. Instead, we have a culture of suitors that say things like, shut your mouth. We're busy greedily eating up the empire, so don't disrupt our way of life. Anyway. All right, so here are my questions, I guess, concluding questions. What vision wants to be born? What vision wants to be born? What vision wants to be born in you? What vision wants to be born even culturally? Like, think less personally. And the thing with vision, especially the kind of vision I'm imagining here, like one that is a widening circle of inclusion and understanding, it's precarious. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go that way. That's what's terrifying about it. You can actually circle the drain. So what vision wants to be born? What is your dream? What's the biggest possible dream you can have in your life with the time remaining? I mean, it's like, I hate to put it this way, but retirement sort of feels like in our culture, I live my life in widening circles and then I retire and I go back down. That's what I'm saying. That's not what Rilke is talking about. I live my life in widening circles. Then he says that reach out across the world, I may not complete this last one. You die way out on the outer rim. He says, but I give myself to it. God, that's a vision of the world I want to move toward. Were you here a couple weeks ago when Rachel was here? If not, you should go back and watch it. She had this poem that started with, I believe in pipe dreams. That's what I'm talking about. I believe in pipe dreams. I believe in a world of widening vision. Yeah, so maybe you're in a season of life where it's time for you to increase your circle. Maybe it's time for you in a mentor capacity, and you don't have to be a certain age, I mean just any age, a mentor capacity where you begin to think about those whose circles are just beginning to widen. Kind of role might you play? Like I love when the prophet said, maybe it's Hosea or one of those prophets, wild, crazy men of the Hebrew Bible. He says, old men will dream dreams. That's an amazing vision. Old men, we can include women here, old human beings will dream dreams. So just for the young people. Or T.S. Eliot says, old men ought to be explorers. Do you get what I'm saying? Do you feel the widening circles? After all, like I said a couple weeks ago, what keeps us from this is a kind of failure of imagination. The only war is the war against imagination, what I was quoting before. So let me just end, I think, again, with hearing from Rilke. I live my life in widening circles. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. The world. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the earth. The world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God. The primordial tower. I have been circling for thousands of years. And I still don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? May this week you live your life in widening circles. Thanks.